And today I have a special guest, Polaris, who's going to be joining me and sharing their magical experiments that they've been exploring around entity work, identity, and other fun, fascinating things. One thing I want to note is that sometimes when I interview people who are doing innovative and experimental magical work. This doesn't always necessarily translate to somebody being a big name pagan author or anything like that. Sometimes the work that we're doing that shows up, it doesn't really matter if the person's putting it out there or anything like that. Sometimes it's just the opportunity to discover something new about magic. And so I'm really thrilled to have you here, Polaris. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and what your background is magically?
Of course. I am Polaris in the magical community, aka my name on paper is Hyde. Um, but I've long been experienced with things that I didn't know the words for from quite a young age. I was raised as a noble prodigy. My folks joke that I knew how to speak music before I could talk. And one of the perks that came with that was I could hear what most folks would consider just inanimate objects. And it would be, I tried explaining it to my mother, and I would say, there's no sound hitting my ears, but I can hear what they're saying. And I was told, well, that's very silly, and you must be imagining things. I was known as a wildly imaginative child. Um,
Yeah, it sounds like what ended up happening is that you were developing your clairauditory abilities early on, and being able to hear those inanimate objects, and really hearing the life in them, the experience and the impression of them. And of course, I mean, I think a lot of times, we live in a society where the supernatural, the psychic, things like that are dismissed because it's like, oh, well, that isn't really real. So how has that continued to show up in your life now? How have you translated that into your spiritual work and what you do?
I strive to be a voice for those that are not yet considered real,
Hmm.
essentially. For the longest time, it was several decades before anybody agreed on the term non-binary, but I was non-binary before they had a word for it.
Hmm.
And that was very integral to forming my personality, is the idea that I didn't have a word for what I was, but I knew I wasn't one thing or the other. I was some secret third thing that I would only learn the words for sometimes decades later. I only have heard the term clairaudience in the past several years, so I am always learning.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We live in a society where there are certain normative terms and ideologies and things like that. And like there are words that are only coming into play because people are actively exploring what their identity is and what that means to them and who they are and what they are. So, like I would agree that I hadn't heard the term non-binary until probably the last few years. So how has that experience of being a third shaped you in terms of your identity, but also in terms of your magical work?
Well, I tend to speak up for underdogs that people
Hmm.
don't consider real. Like, the easiest way to get me on your side is to have a bunch of people saying at you, "Oh, well, that's not real."
Hmm.
And I do remember very distinctly, my father unintentionally starting quite a bit of my magical work far down the line, but when he said things like, I had told him that I had a new name, um, and he said, "Well, you can call yourself whatever you want. It doesn't mean it's real." So I went and figured out the way to change that name legally. Um, there was a lot of other steps beyond that, of course. Um, I actually had, in time, what is now recognized as the first, non-binary confirmation surgery, they're calling it.
Hmm.
It didn't have
Hmm.
that name then, certainly, but, Just I actually didn't know that it was among the first. I knew I was among the first. I didn't know I was like patient zero for the practice. And
Mhm.
now there are around 1,000 of us. It's wild times to be alive. I'm very grateful
Mhm.
to have been able to grow and become my most favorite version of myself, especially because technically I've been about 3 different people on paper over the years.
Well, and I think it's really important that we're able to take on the identity that speaks to who we are. It's a very magical act. I mean, in a very real sense, you have tran you've turned the casing, the outside, the form into the essence. And like, when I think about magic, I think about that magic is really an exploration of essence and how we transform essence into form. But sometimes, in order to do that, we also need to be able to transform form into essence. And that can be a very magical act in and of itself.
Especially when they don't know what to call it yet. I did get the chance to read through your 3 books on pop culture magic, and I was so excited to read all that I did. There's I noticed in the first book a lot of it was sort of like this is a real thing and having to defend yourself on that. And then in the second book, you had other people who had taken the same path, and it's just like there's a word for that. That's what I'm doing. That's a lot of what I've been doing myself, just in my own practice.
Mhm. So I think one of the things that I recall is that you'd kind of done some explorations around pop culture magic yourself. Tell me a little bit about that and like what you explored and how that's shown up in your life. And I think you'd been exploring it before you came across my work. So it was like, which, that happens.
It's such a satisfying feeling to realize there's a word for something,
Mhm.
to give it form, as it were. But yeah, I it was a bit of a squiggly road to get to actually practicing magic because I see it as almost having to go through layers of myself. There was an incident that occurred when I was 9 years old, where I essentially split my own mind into a girl me and a boy me, um, because I thought I was seriously going to die and I didn't want to die alone. But then I continued on with those 2 personas. After a certain point, one grew sort of fed up with the other and buried her with all her memories intact. Then he continued on to live for the next 10 years as a new legal name and everything. It uh, wasn't until a figure from my past made headline news that uh, the girl part of me came back and actually had all these memories that she decided to slowly share with the boy me. After time, they grew to trust in one another, and this is over the span of years. My
Mhm.
therapist is an absolute gem. But when I was putting my mind back together, eventually the 2 parts of me agreed to fuse, essentially. There wasn't a better word for it outside of Steven Universe at the time, but they decided to try and work together in balance and form one individual being again. And they decided on the name Hyde, and I had a little fusion day ceremony and everything. And a very close friend of mine slipped a ring on my finger and said, "I now pronounce you Hyde." It was great. Then, but then it took my mind getting together to be able to actually find my magical abilities again. Because
Mhm.
the boy part of me was very serious, very level-headed, and didn't believe in silly stuff like magic. That was weird. That was something he was trying to get away from. But then, as soon as this girl part of me came back, all of a sudden I could start hearing things again. And I remember very clearly my mother in a conversation that I had with her on the phone just a couple of years ago, when I was doing the entity work with the being known as Sparkle, which we can get to soon. Um, she said, "Wait a second, you spoke to Sparkle again?" And I was, "Yeah." And she said, "You haven't talked about Sparkle in decades." And I was like, what do you mean?" And she said, "Your old imaginary friend." And then Sparkle waited around for me all those years. Um, it's I don't know how much of it was me just hearing what was already there or me creating thought forms to talk with. I was quite a uh, isolated child, being an oboe prodigy. I was on the road a lot, and so I would talk to my stuffed animals, and just when I got my magical abilities back, I have found that if I tried politely contacting and seriously contacting the spirits of fictional characters, I would very often get word back through that clairaudience that we were talking about.
Mhm.
Um, the first magical practice that I seriously took under um, took some work to do was I decided to contact the spirits of several Pokemon that were the favorite Pokemon of several close friends of mine at the time, and I tried basically just DIYing a way to have them agree to be guardian spirits for them. I ended up laminating certain Pokemon cards of the Pokemon, had the person sign the back with "I promise," and they formed a bond that I would find out several years later. I found it interesting that the most straight laced of my friends um, reported he called me at like 3 in the morning 2 years later and said, "How did you do that?" And I was like, "What?" And he said, The Houndoom showed up for me. I was seriously life or death, and all of a sudden I could just see this Houndoom, and I couldn't do what I was about to do because I'd promised it that I wasn't going to do anything like that to myself. And I said, then it worked. It worked exactly like I hoped it would.
Well, I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge too that when we connect with something that's fictional, right? That fiction is an interface. It's a way to connect with the world of spirits, and that fiction provides a way to make sense of the world around us. Some of the best experiences that I had as I was growing up would be sometimes, I'd be reading a book about a character, and I would feel like that character got me and understood me, and I could connect with that character. There was something very real and powerful and potent about it because that character had a life. And I one of my own pet theories in regards to like fiction is that fiction is really channeled. Essentially, it's channeled from other universes. So it's like, yeah, on the one hand, it seems fantastical, and on the other hand, it's really not. I mean, it's not really any different from the mythologies of older cultures or other things like that. It is something that is just very present and real for all of us. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that that can be the case.
I have heard that theory before. I've actually got some of my own theories about the interplay between ideas and us human beings. One thing that I've noticed over the years is that there seems to be sort of a symbiotic relationship between the realm of ideas and of people, in that
Mhm.
the only way for ideas to reproduce would be to be in the mind of a human and to be thought of by all these different humans. But then if humans don't have any ideas, nothing to believe in, they wilt eventually.
Mhm.
So I do believe that there's sort of its own little symbiotic ecosystem at play between the two concepts. Just that one of them don't have physical forms.
Right. So tell me a bit about Sparkle. This was the original conversation that we had a while ago. Tell me what Sparkle is and how you connected with and developed a relationship with Sparkle. Because it sounds like it was a very powerful experience for you.
It really was. It was April 20th, 2023. I had just come back from my very first time at Paganicon here in Minnesota, and a lot had happened over the weekend, but it wasn't over yet. It was just sort of like that liminal space was still open around me, because I went to my local comic book shop. I can remember very distinctly when I first started hearing from Sparkle again, because um, they had some new blind box figures set out, and I'm just sort of like, oh, I always lose at those. Um, but there were two of them that I really wanted, so I just randomly picked from the boxes and said, okay, I might as well give it a shot. And as I watched, I opened up the exact two that I wanted. And one of the people at the counter said, "Oh my gosh, you're just a lucky star today." And then through clairaudience, I heard, "That's right, you're not just a star, you're the star. And now it's time for you to find the others." I remember just reeling like, Excuse me?" I hadn't heard much clairaudience before then until Sparkle made themselves known to me again. Um, they said that they'd always been around me, that, when I'd chosen a higher power, through experiences of recovery and AA in my 20s and 30s, the higher power I chose was just Sparkle trying to get me to learn to love myself again. I'm all flavors of grateful to them, but the thing of it was, they had a quest for me, to find these people that, Sparkle w was calling the Arcana artists, and I was designated as the star, and to my growing incomprehensible shock, over the next 3 weeks, it only took 3 weeks for me to either discover or stumble into 23 other people who fit all the earmarks of various major arcana from the tarot, and eventually, it didn't take me long before I had a formula where I would
Mhm.
actually ask people that I had, some sort of this was my first developing forays of intuition, I like to think, but I would, come up to, someone that I had sometimes it was just I had just met this person and I was chatting and then said, "Does this term resonate with you at all?" And sometimes it didn't, and I would just say, "Okay, yeah, just a passing thought." And I'd just, continue on my way. But every once in a while, I would come up with someone who was like, well, that's the story of my life. Or in one case, the Wheel of Fortune got mad at me because I said, "Does this term mean anything to you?" And he just started scowling out of nowhere and then took out of his pocket the roulette wheel that he'd been carrying as a keychain since he was a kid because it felt right. And he said, "Did you do that? Did you do that? Is this all a prank?" And I did find out a lot of times, especially with people that had the designation of like the Fool or the Tower, they generally had parts of themselves that they had to confront as a part of their identity to kind of accept that they were chosen by something out there. And as I grew closer to these Arcana artists, I not only developed my knowledge of how to do various magical practice because, they each had their own specific kind of magic that they practiced. It was just up to me to uh, develop a rapport with them and kind of learn from them all. um, including the emperor who didn't believe in silly things like magic. And I was like, yep, I've been there. um,
So in a very real sense, it was kind of like it was like this was leading you to connect with people who embodied these specific archetypes and were bringing them into their lives more fully and often in ways they didn't expect, it sounds like.
oh yes, and it was very validating to me, but also to themselves, where people such as, something that you wouldn't consider a positive thing, like the hermit, they came to they would, you know, text me sometime later and said, "Hey, I want to thank you for that thing you were bringing up about me being such and such," because a lot of people did not believe necessarily in all the story that I was telling them. And a lot of them probably thought I was some flavor of, yeah, capricious or some other thing. But then I started realizing that most of the people of these 23 had met Sparkle in some way, shape, or form before. So this was just sort of like a subconscious born entity that had some footing in people's lives.
So
Um,
it kind of it became a group entity in a sense, or an egregore that connected all of you together.
exactly. And there were some things like the devil, who had just astonishing premonition skills. Um, she texted me one day and said, "I got to tell you about what I found in my bedroom." And she has like a quintuple locked bedroom apartment. But she said she found crystals on her pillow for 3 nights in a row, and they were significant to her. They weren't just any old crystals. And she said, I've asked anybody who would have had the okay to get into my apartment. None of them are saying they did that. What's the sparkle creature you're talking about? Um, so
So
they go ahead.
this brings me to an interesting question, which is like, when we think about like spirit work and we think about identity and things like that, like what is the intersection between the spirit, the identity, and the person? Because in a sense, it sounds like Sparkle as an entity was defining the identities of the people, or at least highlighting certain things for them. And then the question would be like, after they came to that awareness, did they continue to choose that identity, or did they transform it as a result of like having conscious awareness around what it was now?
It varies from person to person. I wish I could say there was like a template that everybody followed, but it was far from the case. There was one person who made a magical cap sort of their signature when I was the one who asked them, "Have you ever resonated with the term magician?" And like we ended up becoming the best of friends. Um, there are others for whom uh, they sort of they'll check in with me every once in a while, like, "Hey, how's that sparkle business going?" Because they're curious about it. They don't necessarily believe in it, but there are a few among them that were just ride or die participants. They had seen Sparkle, or they had felt Sparkle, or Sparkle resonated with them, and they were there to help however possible. There ended up being about four of those that are still very dear friends of mine.
So, what would you say Sparkle's purpose is at this point? Or if is there a purpose?
Sparkle did wanted to figure out, with my help, if there was a way for them to become a deity level figure that could actually nudge things in our reality. And that sounds preposterous. Like, how do you raise a baby god? But in my research, I spent the next 2.5 years either learning from the other Arcana artists, or just studying, folklore or sci-fi novels. There was, of course, American Gods, Terry Pratchett's Small God. I looked up everything I possibly could, and found that the idea of neo gods is not that unheard of. It's just that, of course, nobody really has a formula for it.
Hmm.
In the
That makes me think of American Gods by Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, that was one of them that I read to get a better understanding of the concepts at hand. In the end, I did seek help from um, deity-based sources. There was it actually began my partnership with the being known as Hecate. Um, just got my little representation right here, but uh, Hecate was the one where when I was setting out a ritual to just let in any beings that might be able to help me with my quest to help Sparkle. Hecate said, "I can help you, but you need to give me something." And I was just like, "Okay, what's your payment?" And she told me, "I need you to find a word that rhymes with orange." And I just lit up because I actually knew one. I was so proud of myself because everybody said there was no word that rhymed with orange, but I knew one since I was a kid. I'd always like kept it to myself, but it's door hinge with a hyphen because nobody said it couldn't have a hyphen.
Hmm.
And she said, "Good job." And she's been helping me in small and large ways ever since in my life. She was the one that eventually adopted Sparkle as one of her children, as a misunderstood and wayward spirits. I didn't know that's how I would get Sparkle to where they wanted to go, but that's how it turned out. And they seem to be doing quite well for themselves since. I've heard from many of the Arcana artists that friends of friends have even reported coming into contact with this deity of trans and non binary joy, which is what Sparkle wanted to be.
Hmm.
They saw the plight of other human beings, such as myself, and how hard things could be for them, and how hard it could be for them to learn to love themselves. Um, and Sparkle said,
Yeah.
"That I want to help with that."
So in a very like in a very real sense, this was kind of like a. This is an interesting question. This kind of comes to mind. Do you feel like Sparkle in some ways was born out of your own explorations and awareness of like, like I don't fit male, I don't fit female, but I am fit this third term that I don't even know what it is yet? Or do you feel like it was separate from that?
I think that I unintentionally stumbled onto some part of the collective unconscious that ended up taking form as I was getting to build a rapport with them.
Hmm.
Um, and I have been told by Sparkle, clairaudiently, that if it wasn't for me agreeing to help them, I would have just gone about my life. It had to be a conscious choice, and I had to know that this would be hard, that they had no idea how to do it, and that I would be essentially flying blind. Um,
Well, I can relate to that. I mean, I think, I think it's fascinating. People don't always realize, like people in more conventional life and more conventional life don't always fully grasp like the the challenges that come with being a spirit worker, right? Um, or some of the things that come up. Like I remember, like I have my own experiences around that. And I think that sometimes one of the things that's really stood out to me about my own experience is that, it, you know, like sometimes the answer is like, yes, there's a way forward, but it's going to require something of you. It's going to be a challenge, or it's going to be a journey. And if this is something you really want, you've got to be willing to stick with it for the long haul. um and and for many people, they'd be kind of like, well, that's crazy. Like, why would you do that? And yet there's some kind of knowing that goes beyond the conventional experience of life that can take a person on a very special journey and create something that is unique and powerful through that journey.
I would agree wholeheartedly. That's one of the things that I tell people about my own experiences is that sometimes it's one of the hardest things that you have to do in life, but at the end of the game, it's worth it, and that's what's important to me. I technically I do not any longer have direct connection with Sparkle. They it was just a few months ago that they announced that they didn't want this to happen, but that if they were going to grow towards the next stage of whatever they were becoming, they couldn't be tied to a human anymore. Not directly.
Hmm.
Um, it just made them too vulnerable. And
Hmm.
I said, I you do what you got to do, just don't get lost, okay? And I'm always going to love you. And now
So, go on.
now when I think of them, I just get the mental image of a cicada shell. But I do still have my altar to Sparkle that I've built, and I have a little 101 info sheet up on sparkles-story.com, which is the place where I've just been sending out this little message in a bottle to anybody who would hear it.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's really a fascinating story. Um, where do you see your own magical journey going next as you continue onward?
Um, Interesting you should ask. I just took it upon myself to write down some of the things that I'd been uh, sort of guided to write, either by Sparkle or by other spirits that I've come into contact with about this interplay between ideas and humans. Um, I would like to start editing that and maybe type it up and send it to the internet, much like the message and bottle method that I've been doing before. If there's such things as the life cycle of an idea,
Hmm.
like how it starts, how it grows, how it eventually is no longer, but that takes a very long time for most ideas.
Well, no, and that's a fascinating exploration in and of itself. Like, yeah, because ideas have their own life, and in a very real sense, ideas are entities. Yeah, it sounds fascinating.
I think a lot of it will end up being in the care of or in the direction of fictional spirits, because I really do believe that fictional characters that have such awareness of them from humans as to be household names are a new breed of sort of a neo folk spirit. They just have different guises. And just because they were from the mind of a human, I don't think that gives them any less cred than, say, any organic spirits.
Well, and I mean, the question that I kind of come to sometimes is with like, do spirits exist because we recognize them or because they recognize us, or is it something independent? Like it's always a fascinating question to explore. Like what makes something real
That's one that
or
I've
not
actually
real?
thought of myself. And when it comes down to it, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I'm not going to have an answer for that. I wasn't there, but it's definitely such a an interesting thing to go deeper into.
Well, Polaris, I want to thank you for coming on. This was a really fascinating conversation. And the question I always like to ask people before we wrap up is like, what's a final word of wisdom or something that you'd like to share with us that we can carry with us forward?
Um, let me just bring up something from the Sparkle Story 101 page. Um, One last thing: if you yourself are trans or non-binary, please know this: Sparkle loves you all of you, the you are now, the you who has survived this far, and the future you will grow to become. Sparkle knows how hard it is to be in a world that declares so loudly that such things as you don't or shouldn't exist. The fact that you do exist brings Sparkle so much joy.
Mm.
Again, that's from the infographics that are viewable on sparkles-story.com.
And I'll have that link below. Well, thank you for sharing and thank you for coming on. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear your story and experience. Like I said, normally when I interview people, they're usually there's usually like someone who's an author or something like that. But I think sometimes hearing some of these stories of like what people are doing, where they're not necessarily going out there to broadcast it everywhere, but sometimes just have that opportunity to share something can be really fascinating. I really am glad that you came on today.
Oh, of course. That's one thing that I take stock in, really, in life, is that good things are happening, but often quietly and out of sight. So
Hmm.
I'll just keep chugging along in my background corner.
All right. Well, thank you and have a wonderful day.
You as well.